For most of human history, sleep did not look the way it does today. There were no alarms, no glowing clocks on the wall, no pressure to close one's eyes and remain unconscious until morning. Instead, the night unfolded slowly, patiently, and people moved through it in ways that now seem almost strange. Imagine waking in the middle of the night, not with anxiety, not with racing thoughts, but with calm acceptance. The room is dark, cold, and quiet. This is not a mistake. This is not insomnia. This is exactly how the night is meant to be. In the Middle Ages, people expected to wake after their first sleep. They prayed, listened, reflected, and rested again. Darkness was not an enemy to fight, but a long companion to endure. Sleep came in pieces, not in one perfect stretch. Tonight, we step back into that forgotten rhythm, into a world without electric light, without clocks, without the modern fear of waking at night. This is a slow journey through medieval nights, their habits, their discomforts, their quiet endurance, and their unusual way of sleeping that once felt completely natural. So dim the lights, let the night take its time, and listen closely because this story begins in the dark. Night arrived differently in the Middle Ages. It did not rush in with bright lights switching on or screens glowing softly in the dark. It came slowly, almost politely, as the sun lowered itself behind fields, forests, or stone walls, leaving behind a long, quiet fading of color. Shadows stretched, sounds softened, and people noticed. They always noticed because the night was not something to ignore. It shaped their lives, their rest, and the way they slept. There were no clocks ticking on walls, no alarms waiting to ring. Time was not measured in minutes, but in changes, the dimming of light, the cooling of air, the quieting of birds. When darkness settled, it did so completely. It wrapped houses, streets, and fields in a deep, honest black that modern eyes rarely experience. And within that darkness, sleep followed a rhythm very different from the one known today. A medieval night was long. In winter especially, it could stretch for 14 hours or more. People did not expect to sleep through all of it in one unbroken stretch. That idea simply did not exist yet. Instead, sleep was understood as something that came in parts, like tides moving in and out. Rest arrived, retreated, and returned again, all without urgency. As evening deepened, households began to prepare for rest. Fires were allowed to die down, carefully banked so they would not burn too fiercely through the night. Candles were used sparingly, if at all. Light was expensive and darkness was free. Most people welcomed it. Darkness meant safety, stillness, and a pause from labor. Beds were simple. A wooden frame, perhaps, or just a raised platform. A sack of straw or chaff served as a mattress. Wool blankets lay heavy on top, sometimes layered thick enough to press the body gently downward. Clothing was rarely removed. Most people slept in the same garments they had worn during the day, adding cloaks or extra layers as protection against the cold. When they lay down, they did so early by modern standards. Soon after sunset, bodies already tired from physical work gave in to rest. The first sleep came quickly and deeply. It was not delicate or dream-filled. It was heavy. Limbs relaxed. Breath slowed. This was the sleep of recovery, the kind that settled into muscles and bones. Outside, the world continued quietly. Wind moved through trees. Animals shifted in barns or nearby fields. In towns, a distant dog might bark once and then fall silent again. Somewhere far away, a watchman might take a few slow steps, his presence known more by sound than sight. Hours passed, and then, naturally, gently, without alarm or fear, many people woke. Eyes opened in the dark. Not suddenly, not with panic, just a calm return to awareness. The room was still. The fire was low. The air was cool. This waking was expected. It had a name, even if it was rarely written down in the way modern terms are. It was simply the time between sleeps. No one thought of this as insomnia. No one lay awake counting worries. This was not a failure of rest. It was part of rest itself. People remained in bed or sat up slowly. Some whispered quiet prayers, spoken from memory rather than books. Others lay still, listening. The night had its own language. The creak of wood, the distant sound of another household shifting, the soft breathing of those still asleep nearby. Without clocks, there was no pressure to return to sleep quickly. Time did not need to be filled or controlled. The darkness held everything evenly. A person might reflect on a dream, turning it over gently in the mind. Dreams were thought to carry meaning, and this quiet waking time was considered the best moment to remember them. Moonlight, if present, slipped through small windows or cracks in shutters, painting pale shapes on walls or floors. The moon did not flood rooms with light, but it offered enough to suggest form and movement. People learned its patterns well. They knew which nights were brighter, which darker. The moon itself became a kind of silent guide through the night. After some time, minutes or an hour, it did not matter, sleep returned. The second sleep was different, lighter, filled with dreams. The body rested again, but the mind wandered more freely. This sleep carried people toward morning, toward the slow return of sound and color. This rhythm repeated night after night, season after season. It was so ordinary that no one felt the need to explain it. It was simply how humans slept when the night was truly dark and time was allowed to move at its own pace. And so, under thick blankets, in rooms shaped by shadow and silence, medieval sleepers rested not in a single stretch, but in harmony with the long, patient hours of the night. As the sun disappeared completely, the world did not rush into sleep all at once. Darkness settled in layers, deepening slowly, giving people time to adjust. First came twilight, a gentle fading when shapes were still visible and colors lingered softly in the air. Then came true night, thick and complete, the kind that erased edges and softened distance. In the Middle Ages, darkness was not pushed away. It was accepted. There were no glowing streets or bright windows stretching into the night. Once the sun was gone, the land returned to its natural state. Fields vanished into shadow. Roads became uncertain lines remembered more by habit than sight. Inside homes, light was minimal and carefully managed. Candles were precious. Tallow candles smoked and smelled, and beeswax candles were costly enough that many households saved them for special occasions. Oil lamps required fuel that was not always easy to spare. Because of this, most people did not try to keep the night bright. Instead, they allowed darkness to remain, moving through familiar spaces slowly and carefully. Doors were closed early. Shutters were pulled tight, not only to keep out the cold, but to block wind and the wandering noises of the night. Inside, families gathered close together for warmth and quiet companionship. Voices lowered naturally, as though the dark itself encouraged softness. The body responded to this environment without resistance. Eyes adjusted, breathing slowed. The absence of sharp light allowed thoughts to settle more gently. Without constant stimulation, the mind had fewer places to rush toward. The night became a wide, calm space rather than something to endure. Sleep followed darkness almost automatically. There was no effort involved, no struggle to fall asleep. When activity ended, rest began. It was understood that the body needed this surrender, especially after long hours of physical work. Fatigue was honest and complete. As people lay down, they did not expect uninterrupted rest. They entered sleep the way they entered night, knowing it had depth, knowing it had stages. The first sleep was trusted to come and trusted to leave. It was not something to cling to or fear losing. Outside, the natural world shifted as well. Nocturnal animals stirred. An owl might call once, then again, its sound traveling far in the still air. Somewhere beyond the walls of a town, hooves moved softly through grass. These sounds were not alarming. They were familiar markers of time passing. Inside a home, the fire glowed faintly, reduced to embers. Its warmth lingered just enough to take the edge off the cold. Shadows flickered across low ceilings and rough walls. Everything seemed slower, as though the dark pressed gently against movement itself. When people woke later in the night, during that quiet middle stretch between sleeps, the darkness felt different. It was no longer something new settling in. It was complete, stable, settled. There was comfort in knowing that nothing else was expected to happen for hours. In these moments, many remained still, listening. Others sat up slowly, careful not to disturb those around them. Night was shared. Privacy was limited, but so was loneliness. The presence of others, even sleeping others, anchored people in the dark. Without clocks, there was no sense of being late or early. Time existed as a feeling rather than a measurement. The night was simply night, and it would remain so until it was ready to release the world back to light. Moonlight played a quiet role. When the moon was full or nearly full, it softened the darkness, offering pale guidance. When it was new, the night became heavier, deeper, almost velvety. People knew the lunar cycle well. It shaped not only travel and work, but rest itself. Some nights felt longer than others, but no one rushed them. The long hours were not filled with anxiety. They were allowed to stretch. The darkness gave permission to pause, to think slowly, or to think not at all. Eventually, without effort, drowsiness returned. Bodies shifted. Blankets were pulled closer. Eyes closed again. The second sleep approached quietly, without ceremony, as natural as the first. And so the night continued, not as a single event, but as a sequence of gentle states. Darkness was not the absence of life. It was a condition in which life moved more softly, more patiently, waiting for the distant promise of morning. The hours between the first and second sleep were neither empty nor fully awake. They were a gentle suspension, a stretch of time that belonged to the night alone. In these hours, people existed without urgency, even when conditions were far from comfortable. The room, now colder than before, held the stillness carefully. With the fire reduced to faint embers, warmth faded slowly but steadily. Breath sometimes appeared in the air, pale and brief, dissolving almost as soon as it formed. This was not alarming. It was expected. Cold was part of the night, especially in winter, and waking during these hours often meant feeling it more clearly. Bedding offered protection, but not perfection. Straw mattresses, packed tightly months ago, had begun to shift and settle unevenly. In places, the straw had softened from moisture rising through floors or walls. The scent of dried grass mixed with dampness lingered quietly beneath blankets. People were accustomed to this. Clean, dry beds were an ideal more than a constant reality. As someone lay awake, wrapped in wool, small discomforts made themselves known. An itch along the arm, a tickle at the ankle. Insects were common companions in medieval sleep. Fleas and lice moved unnoticed most of the time, their presence so familiar that it rarely caused alarm. A sleeper might scratch lightly, even while half dreaming, then return to stillness. Despite this, the night remained calm. The mind, softened by rest, did not fixate on discomfort. Sensations came and went without becoming urgent. The body knew how to endure. In shared spaces, sounds were subtle but constant. A child shifted nearby. An older relative coughed softly. Somewhere in the room, an animal stirred. Perhaps a dog curled near the hearth, or in poorer homes, livestock resting close enough to share warmth. Their presence added noise and smell, but also comfort. Body heat mattered. Air moved slowly through the room, carrying traces of smoke, wool, and human presence. Without open windows, the air grew heavy, but it was familiar. People breathed it night after night, rarely thinking to question it. Fresh air was associated with cold and danger, not relief. Those who rose during this time did so carefully. Floors were cold and sometimes damp beneath bare or thinly covered feet. Stone held moisture. Earth floors absorbed it. Standing up meant losing heat quickly, so movements were deliberate and brief. Some reached for a chamber pot kept close to the bed. Going outside at night was avoided whenever possible. Darkness, cold, and uneven ground made it risky. Many chose to endure discomfort rather than leave the safety of their shelter. In these hours, prayer was common, but so was simple listening. The night spoke quietly. Wind pressed against walls. Wood expanded or contracted with the cold, producing small, sharp sounds. To modern ears, these noises might feel unsettling. To medieval ones, they were ordinary signs that the house was alive and holding. Not every sound was pleasant. Sometimes someone groaned softly in their sleep, ill or fevered. Sometimes an animal outside cried briefly. These moments were noted, then released. There was little to be done in the dark hours, and so people learned not to dwell on what they could not change. Despite the discomforts, there was also peace here. No labor waited. No voices demanded attention. The night belonged to no one and everyone at once. Even unpleasant sensations softened when there was nothing to compare them to. As time passed, wakefulness faded again. Bodies, having adjusted to the cold and stillness, began to sink back into rest. Itches were forgotten. Sounds blended into the background. Thoughts slowed until they lost shape entirely. The second sleep approached quietly, not as relief, but as continuation. The night was not divided into good and bad parts. It was simply endured, accepted, and lived through one calm moment at a time. The first sleep arrived with little resistance. After the long day had ended and the body had given up its remaining warmth to the cooling air, rest came naturally, like a door closing on its own. People did not lie awake negotiating with their thoughts. They did not count minutes or measure fatigue. When the body was ready, it simply sank. This first sleep was the deepest of the night. Carried weight. Muscles that had worked since dawn loosened slowly, releasing the ache of repetitive motion and cold. Breathing became long and steady. Limbs grew heavy, as though gravity itself had increased slightly, pulling the body downward into stillness. In this phase of sleep, dreams were rare. The mind did not wander far. It stayed close to the body, focused on restoration rather than imagination. Medieval writers who mention sleep describe this first rest as thick and complete, a state in which the sleeper was difficult to wake. The world outside could continue without interruption. Wind could rise and fall. Rain could tap against roofs or shutters. Animals might move nearby. None of it mattered. The first sleep wrapped the body like a dense blanket, insulating it not only from cold, but from awareness. Inside shared rooms, several people often slept close together. Family members, children, sometimes even servants or travelers rested in the same space. During the first sleep, this closeness went unnoticed. Bodies were still. Sounds of breathing blended together. The room became a single, slow-moving presence. This deep rest was especially important in a world shaped by physical labor. Fields, workshops, kitchens, and roads demanded strength every day. The first sleep repaired what had been worn down. It was not indulgent. It was necessary. There was no effort made to extend it artificially. No one tried to force themselves to stay asleep longer than the body allowed. Sleep was trusted. When it came, it was welcomed. When it left, it was accepted. As hours passed, the body began to lighten again. Not suddenly, but gradually. Muscles shifted slightly. Breathing changed. The heavy grip of the first sleep loosened. Somewhere between darkness and awareness, the sleeper moved closer to waking. This transition was gentle. There was no alarm to tear through the silence. No sudden jolt back into consciousness. Instead, awareness returned the way dawn would later return. Slowly, without urgency. Eyes opened into darkness. The room was the same, yet different. Familiar shapes were sensed rather than seen. The air felt cooler. The fire had dimmed further. The body no longer felt buried under its own weight. Waking during the night did not carry fear. There was no sense of failure in it. People did not worry that something had gone wrong. This was simply the next stage of rest. Some remained lying down, wrapped in blankets, letting thoughts drift lightly. Others sat up, careful and quiet. Movements were slow, unhurried. There was no need to rush back into sleep or rush away from it. The first sleep had done its work. The body had been restored enough to release its grip. What followed was not interruption, but continuation, a pause between two natural tides of rest. In this quiet middle time, the mind was clearer than during the day. Fatigue had softened it. Worries lost their sharp edges. Thoughts moved more slowly if they moved at all. For many, this was the most peaceful waking they experienced. The darkness felt familiar now, not enclosing but surrounding gently. It was a space to exist in, not something to escape from. The night still stretched far ahead, and there was comfort in knowing that nothing else was required yet. Eventually, without instruction, the body would grow heavy again. Eyelids would lower. Breathing would deepen once more. The second sleep waited patiently, ready to arrive when the moment felt right. The first sleep had passed not as a single event, but as part of a larger rhythm. It had carried the sleeper into the night, preparing them for the softer hours that followed. The second sleep did not arrive with the same weight as the first. It came quietly, almost politely, as though asking permission rather than demanding rest. After the long waking pause in the middle of the night, the body accepted sleep again, but in a different way. Limbs did not sink as deeply this time. Breathing slowed, but remained lighter. The body rested, yet stayed closer to the surface of awareness. This was the sleep of drifting rather than sinking. People often entered the second sleep without fully realizing it. Thoughts loosened, then blurred, then disappeared altogether. There was no clear line where waking ended and sleep began. One moment the mind lingered on a sound or a memory, and the next it was elsewhere entirely. Dreams belonged mostly to this part of the night. Unlike the rare, heavy stillness of the first sleep, the second sleep allowed images to move freely. Dreams wandered through familiar places, fields, kitchens, roads, churches, reshaped gently by memory and fatigue. These dreams were not always pleasant. Some carried discomfort from the body into the mind. Cold appeared as wind or water. Hunger appeared as endless walking. Pain became weight or pressure. Still, these dreams were not considered intrusive. They were part of rest, not interruptions of it. The body, even while dreaming, remained aware of its surroundings. A sudden noise might shift the dream rather than break it. A cough nearby could turn into a voice within the dream. Sensations blended easily with little resistance. Unpleasant realities continued quietly beneath the surface of sleep. Blankets cooled. Moisture from breath dampened fabric near the face. Insects moved, unnoticed or half noticed. Joints stiffened again as the body lay still for too long. Yet the mind did not fight these things. In the second sleep, tolerance was higher. Discomfort existed, but it did not dominate. The mind floated above it, returning only briefly before drifting away again. In shared sleeping spaces, the second sleep often brought more movement. Someone shifted, another murmured, a child stirred, then settled. These disturbances rarely woke anyone fully. They were absorbed into the general rhythm of rest. Outside, the night moved closer to its coldest point. Just before dawn, temperature often dropped further. Stone and earth released the heat they had held. Air grew sharper. Those lightly asleep felt this change, pulling covers closer without waking completely. The second sleep stretched toward morning, not evenly, but in waves. People drifted in and out of shallow dreams. Awareness rose briefly, then fell again. Time lost its shape entirely. There was no expectation of waking refreshed. Rest was cumulative, gathered in pieces rather than delivered all at once. People accepted this. They did not measure sleep by how they felt upon waking, but by whether they could rise and work again. As dawn approached, dreams thinned. The mind began to loosen its grip on images. Awareness widened slowly. Sounds returned with more clarity. A bird called once, then again. Somewhere, a door creaked open earlier than usual. The second sleep released its hold gradually. Bodies remained heavy, but no longer fully surrendered. The night, having given what it could, began to withdraw. People woke without urgency. There was no sudden transition, just a slow awareness that darkness was lifting, that sound was returning, that another day was forming quietly beyond walls and shutters. The second sleep had done its work. It had carried the mind gently through the longest hours of the night, allowing rest to continue even as discomfort remained. And so, between cold and warmth, dreams and wakefulness, stillness and small movement, medieval sleepers reached the edge of morning. Not abruptly, but slowly, carried there by the soft, uneven rhythm of the night itself. For medieval people, the pattern of sleeping in two parts did not feel unusual or broken. It felt natural, shaped by the world they lived in rather than by rules or expectations. Night was long, darkness was complete, and the body, left to follow its own rhythm, responded accordingly. There was no idea that sleep needed to be uninterrupted in order to be good. Rest was measured by endurance, not by comfort. If a person could rise in the morning and work again, the night had done its job. This understanding removed pressure. Waking during the night did not cause worry. It did not lead to frustration or fear that something was wrong. The body was allowed to wake, to listen, to feel, and then to rest again when ready. Life itself reinforced this acceptance. Days were physically demanding. Muscles tired deeply. Hands ached. Feet carried weight across uneven ground for hours. When evening came, fatigue was honest and complete. Sleep followed naturally without negotiation. At the same time, nights were not designed for perfect rest. Cold, noise, dampness, and shared space made that impossible. Instead of fighting these conditions, people adapted to them. They slept lightly when needed, deeply when possible, and accepted wakefulness as part of the cycle. The absence of artificial light played a central role. Without bright evenings, the body aligned itself closely with sunset and sunrise. Melatonin rose naturally. Alertness faded. Waking during the night was not caused by distraction, but by biology responding to long darkness. The division of sleep also created space, not physical space but mental space. The quiet hours between sleeps allowed reflection without pressure. Thoughts that had no room during the day could surface briefly, then drift away. This time belonged to no task and no authority. It was not claimed by work, by family, or even by strict ritual. It existed simply because the night was long enough to allow it. Unpleasant realities did not cancel this sense of normalcy. Insects, cold, discomfort, and shared beds were expected. They were not viewed as failures of sleep, but as conditions of life. Endurance was quiet, not heroic. Even fear, when it appeared, was contained. Night was not romanticized, but it was not constantly feared either. Familiarity softened it. People knew what the night usually held, and that knowledge brought calm. Importantly, no one compared their sleep to an ideal. There was no single standard to meet. Each night unfolded slightly differently, and this variation was accepted. Seasonal change reinforced this flexibility. Winter nights stretched long, allowing more waking time between sleeps. Summer nights shortened, compressing rest into fewer hours. The body adjusted without complaint. Religious belief also supported this rhythm. Night waking was often associated with prayer or contemplation, not with failure. Being awake in darkness could feel purposeful, even meaningful, without effort. Over time, this way of sleeping became invisible. It did not need explanation. It was simply how nights worked. Only much later, when artificial light shortened darkness and reshaped evenings, did uninterrupted sleep become an expectation. What had once been normal came to be seen as strange. But for medieval people, there was nothing strange about it at all. Sleep came, left, and returned again, just as the night itself did. Slowly, imperfectly, and without apology. And because it was accepted, it rarely became a source of distress. As the night moved forward, it did not announce itself clearly. There was no sharp division between 1 hour and the next. Instead, time passed in layers, marked only by subtle changes that required patience to notice. In this slow movement, certain sounds acted as gentle anchors, reminding people that the world was still turning, even while most bodies rested. In towns and larger villages, bells played this quiet role. They were not rung often, and never without reason. A bell at night was softer than one at day, its sound allowed to travel farther through the cool air. It did not command attention. It simply existed, a low vibration that faded gradually into silence. Those awake during the night did not count these bells. They did not calculate how much night remained. Instead, they received the sound as reassurance. Someone was awake. Someone was watching. The night was being observed, even as it remained dark and still. Watchmen moved slowly through streets and courtyards. Their steps were deliberate, spaced evenly, chosen more for quiet endurance than speed. Footsteps echoed faintly against stone, then disappeared again. Often, the sound of movement mattered more than the sight of it. These figures were rarely seen clearly. Cloaks blended into shadow. Faces were indistinct. What mattered was presence, not identity. The night did not require detail. It required continuity. For those lying awake in bed, these distant sounds shaped awareness gently. A bell, a step, a low murmur carried on the wind. Each one confirmed that the world had not stopped while they rested. This knowledge allowed the body to relax further, even if sleep did not return immediately. In poorer homes, without bells or formal watchmen, the same role was played by more humble sounds. A neighbor coughing through a thin wall, a door shifting slightly in the wind, an animal moving in a nearby stall. These signals were quieter, but no less meaningful. Night air carried sound efficiently. Cold sharpened it. A noise that would vanish during the day traveled clearly after sunset. People learned to recognize distance by ear alone. A sound close enough to matter felt different from one that could be ignored. Not all sounds brought comfort. Sometimes a noise arrived without explanation. A sudden thud, a sharp crack, a cry that ended too quickly. In such moments, stillness followed. No one rushed to respond. Listening came first. Most unexplained sounds resolved themselves. When settled, an animal moved away. The night returned to its usual pattern. Fear, when it appeared, was brief and contained. There was little energy to sustain it. Inside rooms, the slow passing of night could be felt physically. Warmth faded gradually. Blankets grew heavier as bodies cooled beneath them. A sleeper might wake just enough to pull wool closer around the shoulders, then sink back again. Discomfort accumulated quietly. A stiff joint, a cramp in the leg, an itch that lingered longer than expected. These sensations were not resisted strongly. Resistance required energy, and energy was saved. Sometimes, someone spoke softly in their sleep. Words emerged without meaning, then dissolved. Others did not react. The night absorbed these sounds without consequence. As hours passed, the body began to anticipate morning without knowing it consciously. Rest shifted again. The second sleep deepened, but it was lighter than the first. Dreams moved more freely now, influenced by memory, sound, and faint light. Bells, if they rang again, felt more distant. Watchmen's steps blended further into the background. Even unpleasant noises lost their shape as awareness softened. The night did not hurry toward its end. It breathed slowly, expanding and contracting around those within it. Each sound, each silence, became part of that breathing. And within this rhythm, bells fading, footsteps passing, cold pressing gently inward, people rested as best they could, trusting that the night would eventually release them, just as it always had. One of the strangest truths about medieval sleep is how little people tried to control it. They did not manage sleep. They did not optimize it. They did not attempt to make it perfect. Instead, they adapted themselves to it, accepting its irregularity as something natural, even necessary. In the medieval understanding, sleep was not a sealed state. It was porous. Sounds passed through it. Sensations reached into it. The body never fully disconnected from the world. This was not considered a flaw. It was considered sensible. At night, hearing remained alert. Even while sleeping, people responded faintly to changes around them. A sudden silence could wake someone faster than a loud noise. Silence suggested absence of wind, of animals, of the usual signals of night. Absence was more unsettling than presence. Sleep, therefore, existed on a spectrum. One could be deeply asleep and still aware enough to turn toward warmth, pull a blanket higher, or shift away from cold air. This half-awareness was protective. It allowed survival in an environment that offered little comfort. The idea of sleeping like the dead would have sounded dangerous. Complete unconsciousness was not desirable. Night was not something to surrender to fully. Another unusual fact lies in how people understood tiredness. Exhaustion was not always followed immediately by sleep. Sometimes the body rested without sleeping, lying still, conserving energy, breathing slowly. This state was not distinguished clearly from sleep itself. During the long nights of winter, people spent many hours neither fully asleep nor fully awake. They rested their bodies even when their minds drifted lightly. Modern language might call this fragmented sleep. Medieval life simply called it night. There was also no expectation that everyone slept at the same time. In one household, some might be in deep first sleep while others were quietly awake between sleeps. This overlap created a soft continuity of awareness within shared spaces. Nighttime conversations, when they happened, were subdued and brief. Words were spoken softly, often without opening eyes fully. These were not discussions meant to reach conclusions. They were murmured thoughts, small observations, or reassurances that someone else was there. Even unpleasant realities were accepted without emphasis. A damp blanket, a crawling insect, the ache of cold joints. These things were noted, then absorbed into the general experience of night. Resistance required energy, and energy was carefully guarded. People did not expect sleep to erase discomfort. Sleep existed alongside it. Another quietly unsettling fact was that night often revealed illness first. Fevers rose more noticeably after sunset. Pain felt sharper when the body stopped moving. Coughing worsened in cold air. Many people became aware of sickness during the night hours, lying awake with sensations they could not yet name. Still, little was done until morning. The night was not a time for intervention. It was endured patiently. Dreams, too, were treated differently. A dream was not immediately interpreted as imagination. It might be memory, message, warning, or nothing at all. The time between sleeps was considered ideal for holding a dream gently in the mind, without forcing meaning onto it. Importantly, no one tried to avoid waking between sleeps. There was no frustration, no anxiety about returning to rest. Sleep was expected to come back on its own. And because it was trusted, it usually did. Perhaps the most surprising truth is this. Medieval people may have been less troubled by their nights than modern sleepers are by theirs. Not because conditions were better, they were far worse, but because expectations were different. Night was allowed to be imperfect. Sleep was allowed to be broken. The body was allowed to wake, listen, feel cold, feel discomfort, and then rest again. Nothing was wrong with this pattern. It was simply human life moving at the speed of darkness. And so, beneath low ceilings, wrapped in wool and shadow, surrounded by familiar sounds and familiar discomforts, people rested not by escaping the night, but by living inside it, slowly, patiently, until morning arrived on its own. Eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dark that had not changed while sleep passed through it. The room remained quiet. The walls stood still. The night had not moved forward in any obvious way, and yet something inside the body had shifted. This was the moment between sleeps, a time neither fully resting nor fully awake. Medieval people recognized it not with concern, but with familiarity. It was expected, like the pause between breaths or the silence between distant sounds. There was no urgency to rise. Most people remained where they were, wrapped in wool and linen, letting awareness settle gently. The body felt lighter than before. The deep heaviness of the first sleep had lifted, leaving behind a calm alertness that did not demand action. Thoughts during this time moved differently. They did not rush or multiply. They appeared slowly, one at a time, often without words. A memory from the day might surface, softened by distance. A dream fragment might linger, fragile and incomplete, hovering at the edge of recall. For some, this waking brought prayer. Not formal or spoken loudly, but quiet phrases remembered by heart. Words shaped by repetition, murmured softly into the dark or held silently in the mind. These prayers were not hurried. They were offered as naturally as breathing. Others simply listened. The night was full of subtle signals. The shift of someone else turning in their sleep. The quiet crack of wood settling. The faint sound of wind pressing against shutters. Each sound placed the listener gently in time and space. Without artificial light, the eyes did not strain. There was nothing to see clearly, and so nothing demanded focus. Darkness allowed the mind to rest even while awake. It removed distraction by its very nature. Some people sat up, careful not to disturb those nearby. They might pull a cloak closer around their shoulders or adjust bedding. Movements were deliberate and slow, guided by habit rather than sight. Hands knew where objects belonged. Feet knew the shape of the floor. This waking period could last a short while or a longer one. There was no measure for it. No one checked how much night remained. Time was not something to be managed, only experienced. Importantly, this waking was not lonely. Even when a person was awake alone, they knew others nearby were sharing the same rhythm, even if at different moments. Somewhere else in the village or town, another household was also quietly awake, suspended in the same dark interval. In written records, this time was often described as peaceful. It was a pause that belonged fully to the individual. The demands of the day had ended, and the demands of morning had not yet arrived. Nothing needed to be decided or accomplished. The body, resting but alert, began to signal when it was ready to return to sleep. A heaviness returned slowly, like a tide moving back toward shore. Eyelids grew warm. Thoughts loosened their grip. There was no need to force this transition. Sleep was not chased. It arrived when it wished, and people trusted it to do so. They had lived their entire lives within this rhythm. It did not need explanation. As the second sleep approached, the waking mind softened again. Awareness faded gradually, leaving behind only the quiet presence of the night. The body settled back into stillness, prepared for the gentler rest that would follow. The middle of the night closed itself without ceremony. It did not announce its ending. It simply gave way as naturally as it had begun. During the quiet waking hours of the night, not everyone remained completely still. Some lay quietly with eyes open, but others made small, careful movements, guided by habit rather than intention. These movements were never hurried. The night did not reward speed. For many, this time between sleeps was associated with prayer. Not dramatic prayer, not spoken aloud in full voice, but quiet words remembered so well they required no effort. These prayers were often repetitive, steady, and familiar, shaped by years of use. In the dark, words felt heavier and slower, as if they settled more deeply into the mind. Prayer did not require light. In fact, darkness was often considered helpful. Without visual distraction, attention turned inward. Even those who were not especially devout sometimes repeated phrases learned in childhood. Not from fear, but from comfort. The rhythm of the words matched the rhythm of breathing. Others did not pray at all. They simply thought. Thoughts in the night were different from daytime thoughts. They were softer, less demanding. Problems from the day appeared less sharp, sometimes losing their edges entirely. The body, still warm beneath layers of wool and cloth, felt temporarily removed from effort and obligation. Unpleasant sensations remained present, but subdued. The cold pressed gently against exposed skin. Fingers or toes might feel stiff. Blankets sometimes slipped, allowing a draft to creep in unnoticed until it had already stolen a bit of warmth. These things were adjusted slowly, with minimal movement conserving heat. The smell of the room was constant. Smoke clung to fabric and hair. Wool carried the faint scent of animals. Dampness from stone or earth floors rose into the air. These smells did not disappear at night. If anything, they grew stronger as the air settled. Yet familiarity dulled their impact. What was always present rarely demanded attention. Insects continued their quiet work. A bite might wake someone briefly, causing a hand to scratch automatically before returning to rest. Such interruptions were accepted without frustration. There was no expectation of perfect comfort. Sometimes someone rose carefully from the bed. This was done only when necessary. Standing meant immediate exposure to cold. Feet met hard, chilled floors that drew warmth away instantly. Movement was slow, deliberate, guided by memory rather than sight. Those who moved tried to keep the night intact. Doors were not opened unless required. Sounds were kept low. The sleeping of others was respected, not formally, but instinctively. Shared space taught awareness. In some homes, a chamber pot was kept nearby. Using it was unpleasant, but preferable to going outside. Night air carried risk. Uneven ground, bitter cold, the possibility of slipping or injury. Most chose inconvenience over danger. Once movement ended, stillness returned. Bodies settled back into place. Blankets were pulled close. The night resumed its quiet hold. Not every thought was peaceful. Sometimes worry crept in, especially during illness or scarcity. Hunger, when present, was felt more strongly at night. Pain from old injuries reminded sleepers of itself when the body was still. These sensations were acknowledged, then endured. People did not analyze these moments. There was little language for inner struggle as it is understood now. Discomfort was part of life, not something to be corrected immediately. Endurance was not praised. It was assumed. Gradually, without instruction, the body began to drift again. Muscles softened. Thoughts slowed further, stretching until they dissolved. The quiet waking hours did not end suddenly. They faded. The second sleep approached not as relief from suffering, but as continuation of a familiar cycle. The night was doing what it always did, moving steadily forward, indifferent to comfort yet strangely gentle in its constancy. In this way, people passed the middle of the night, with prayer or without, in stillness or slight movement, accompanied by both calm and discomfort, trusting that rest would return when the body was ready. And it did. In the absence of light, sound became the quiet guide of the night. People did not need to see in order to understand where they were or what time it was. Their ears, trained by habit and necessity, gathered information patiently, one small noise at a time. The night was never completely silent. Even in the deepest hours, something was always moving. Wood expanded and contracted as the air cooled. Roofs shifted slightly. A beam might creak, then settle again. These sounds were familiar, like the breathing of the house itself. Outside, the world continued at a slower pace. Animals moved through darkness with confidence humans lacked. A horse stamped once in a stable. Cow shifted its weight. Somewhere farther away, a dog barked briefly, then stopped, as though remembering the hour. These sounds were not frightening. They were reassuring. They confirmed that life was continuing as it should. A sudden lack of sound would have felt stranger than noise. Inside shared rooms, sleepers learned to recognize each other by subtle cues. The rhythm of breathing, a habitual cough, the quiet sigh of someone turning over. Each sound placed a familiar presence in the dark, reducing uncertainty. Not all sounds were pleasant. Mice were common visitors, especially in winter. Their small movements could be heard in walls, floors, or near stored food. Scratching, soft and quick, sometimes woke light sleepers briefly. This was endured rather than confronted. Darkness limited options, and the night was not a time for correction. Occasionally, water made itself known. In stone buildings, moisture gathered slowly. A drop might fall from a beam or wall, striking the floor with a soft, repetitive sound. Could continue for hours. People noticed it, then let it blend into the background. In towns, more structured sounds appeared. A distant bell might mark a watch change. Not loud, not insistent, just enough to carry through the dark air. Those who heard it did not rise or react strongly. It was simply a signal that the night was moving forward. In villages and countryside, wind played a larger role. It moved through trees, across fields, and along walls. It found gaps in shutters and doors, slipping inside as cold air that touched skin quietly. Drafts were felt before they were heard. Cold made sound sharper. Footsteps, even distant ones, carried farther. A late traveler or watchman could be tracked by ear long before being seen, if seen at all. This awareness was part of survival, but also part of familiarity. People knew which sounds belonged and which did not. Most nights passed without anything unusual. When something unfamiliar did occur, a sudden cry, a loud crash, it was met with stillness first, not action. The night encouraged listening before moving. In bed, wrapped tightly against the cold, people adjusted their position in response to sound rather than sight. A noise closer than expected might cause someone to pull a blanket higher or turn slightly toward warmth. These movements were small and automatic. Even unpleasant sounds lost their edge with repetition. The scratching of insects, the soft grinding of teeth, the restless movement of someone uncomfortable. None of it broke the night apart. It all folded into it. As the second sleep deepened, sounds softened again. Awareness faded. The mind stopped sorting noises into meaning and allowed them to pass freely. The night returned to being a single, steady presence rather than a collection of details. Sound had done its work. It had guided the waking moments without demanding attention. It had reassured, irritated, informed, and then quietly stepped aside. The body settled once more, carried gently by the familiar noises of night, toward rest that required no effort and no awareness of time. People did not rely on moonlight in the way modern light is used. They did not expect clarity. Instead, they accepted suggestion. Moonlight entered rooms carefully. It slipped through narrow windows, cracks in shutters, or thin, imperfect glass. It rested on floors and walls in pale, uneven patches. It never stayed still. As clouds moved or the moon shifted, these shapes changed slowly, almost imperceptibly. Those awake during the night noticed the moon without thinking much about it. This presence was comforting rather than useful. It confirmed that the sky was clear, that weather was stable, that nothing unusual pressed down from above. On brighter nights, moving indoors was slightly easier. A person could recognize the outline of a bench, the edge of a doorway, the darker shape of a hearth. Still, movement remained cautious. Moonlight softened edges rather than sharpening them. Outside, the moon mattered more. Paths, fences, and trees revealed themselves faintly. People who had to move at night, watchmen, travelers delayed by circumstance, or those tending animals, chose moonlit hours when possible. Darkness without moonlight was heavier, more uncertain. Even then, the ground was uneven. Stones caught feet. Mud pulled at shoes. Cold settled into joints more deeply when standing still. Moonlight did not remove discomfort. It simply allowed it to be endured with slightly more awareness. In homes, moonlit nights brought subtle changes. Sleepers sometimes woke more easily. Light touched closed eyelids faintly, shifting the depth of rest. Dreams during the second sleep often grew more vivid under moonlit skies, though people did not connect this to light in any scientific way. There were nights when the moon revealed unpleasant details that darkness usually softened. The damp sheen on stone floors, the uneven surface of bedding, the slow movement of insects along walls or beams. These things existed always, but moonlight sometimes made them briefly visible. No effort was made to correct them at that hour. The night was not for cleaning or repair. Seeing was enough. Action waited for daylight. People understood the moon's cycle well. They knew which nights would be darker, which brighter. This knowledge shaped expectations. A moonless night was accepted as deeper, quieter, and more inward. A full moon brought a sense of openness, even when sleep remained unchanged. Despite this awareness, the moon was not romanticized in everyday life. It was practical, familiar, and distant. It did not promise comfort. It simply existed like cold, like silence, like time itself. As the night progressed, moonlight shifted again. What had been visible faded. What had been hidden reappeared. The room returned to deeper shadow. Wakefulness softened. Bodies adjusted instinctively. A sleeper might turn away from a faint beam of light. A blanket might be pulled higher as temperature dipped again. These movements happened without thought. Eventually, moonlight lost its influence entirely. Sleep thickened. Awareness narrowed. The moon continued its slow journey outside, indifferent to whether anyone noticed. Inside, rest deepened again, carrying the sleeper further into the second half of the night, where light and darkness mattered less than warmth, stillness, and the quiet persistence of breathing. The hour before morning was often the hardest part of the night. It arrived quietly, without announcing itself, but the body felt it all the same. Warmth that had been held through the earlier hours finally slipped away, drawn out by stone, earth, and air that had cooled steadily since sunset. In this final stretch of darkness, the cold settled deepest. Walls released the chill they had stored. Floors felt harder, less forgiving. Even those wrapped tightly in will sense the change, a subtle tightening in muscles, a stiffness that crept into joints. People in the Middle Ages knew this hour well, even if they did not name it precisely. It was the time when sleep grew shallow, when dreams faded more easily, when waking came more often without intention. Bodies, no longer fully protected by rest, noticed their surroundings again. Breath felt sharper in the lungs. Fingers curled inward to preserve heat. A sleeper might pull their cloak higher around the neck, or tuck feet closer to the body. These movements happened slowly, often without opening the eyes. The air itself felt different, still but heavier. Smoke from the hearth lingered close to the ground. Dampness rose faintly from stone or packed earth. Smells became more noticeable: old wool, human presence, faint traces of animals nearby. In shared spaces, more people stirred during this hour. Someone turned over with effort. Another sighed quietly. A cough echoed once, then faded. These sounds did not break the night. They belonged to it. Illness made itself known most clearly at this time. Fevers burned hotter against the surrounding cold. Aches sharpened. Pain that was ignored during the day found space to speak in the stillness. Many people first realized they were becoming sick during these hours, lying awake with sensations they could not yet name. There was little to be done. Remedies waited for daylight. The night was endured as it was. Outside, the world prepared for morning without haste. Wind slowed. Animals grew quiet. The sky, still dark, held a faint change that could not yet be seen but could sometimes be felt. A loosening of night's grip. Those awake did not rise early out of choice. Rising meant leaving what little warmth remained. Beds, however imperfect, still offered protection. People stayed where they were, conserving heat, waiting. The second sleep thinned further. Rest became fragmented. Awareness returned in brief moments, then slipped away again. Time felt stretched, almost suspended, as though the night hesitated before releasing the world. Yet there was also calm here, a quiet acceptance. This was the final test of the night, and it was familiar. People had lived through it countless times before. They trusted that it would pass. Gradually, the cold stopped deepening. It held steady, as if reaching its limit. This, too, was noticed by the body. A sense of balance returned, faint but real. Somewhere a bird called, not boldly but cautiously. Just one sound, then silence again. It was not yet morning, but it was no longer the deepest night. Sleep, now light and fragile, lingered as long as it could. Bodies rested where they were, neither fully awake nor fully asleep, suspended between endurance and anticipation. The night had almost finished its work, and in this coldest hour, wrapped in stillness and shallow rest, medieval sleepers waited. Not impatiently, not anxiously, but quietly, for the slow, inevitable return of light. Thoughts lost their straight lines. Memories loosened their edges. Images rose without invitation and faded without explanation. This was the hour when dreams carried the most weight, not because they were clearer, but because the mind was softer. During the second sleep and the light waking that followed it, dreams slipped easily into awareness. A person might wake with the feeling of having been somewhere familiar, a road walked many times, a room from childhood, a field seen in another season. These places did not appear sharply. They arrived blurred, as though seen through mist. People did not dismiss these dreams quickly. They allowed them to linger. The time between sleep and waking was considered the best moment to hold a dream gently, before the noise of the day erased it. Even those who did not actively interpret dreams noticed them more during these hours. Dreams were not always comforting. The body's discomfort often shaped them. Cold became water or wind. Hunger became long, pointless journeys. Pain appeared as pressure or heaviness. These dreams were accepted as natural reflections of the body's state, not as signs of failure or weakness. Fear appeared rarely, but when it did, it was quiet. Not sudden terror, but unease that settled slowly. A sense of being watched, a feeling of being lost. Such dreams were endured rather than analyzed. Morning, people believed, would weaken their hold. The night mind did not demand explanations. It observed, experienced, and moved on. This was one of its strengths. Even when awake, thoughts followed a dreamlike pattern. One idea drifted into another without resistance. There was no effort to organize or correct them. Logic loosened. The mind rested in its own way even without sleep. In shared rooms, this quiet mental wandering happened alongside others doing the same. Several minds, each half awake, half dreaming, occupied the same dark space without colliding. No one knew exactly where the others were, mentally or physically. This separation was gentle, not isolating. Unpleasant sensations continued beneath these drifting thoughts. The cold pressed steadily inward. Blankets no longer held as much warmth. The body felt heavier, slower to respond. Muscles stiffened from hours of stillness. Occasionally, discomfort interrupted the night mind. A sharp ache, a sudden chill, an insect bite noticed too late. Awareness sharpened briefly, then softened again. The mind returned to its slow movement without protest. Dreams sometimes repeated. The same image returned night after night, especially during illness or worry. People noticed this repetition, but did not always seek meaning in it. Some things were simply carried until they passed. As the sky outside began its subtle shift, dreams thinned. They lost color and detail. The mind released them more easily. What remained was a quiet awareness, not yet ready for the day, but no longer fully within the night. This transition was not abrupt. It unfolded slowly, like fog lifting from a field. Awareness widened gently. The mind became less inward, more attentive to sound, temperature, and space. The night mind did not disappear completely. Traces of it lingered into morning, in mood, in memory, in the way the body moved more slowly at first. But its deepest work was done before dawn. Dreams faded. Thoughts settled. The mind, having wandered freely through darkness, prepared to return to the ordered demands of daylight. And so, in the quiet space between the last dream and the first sound of morning, medieval sleepers rested not only their bodies, but their thoughts, allowing the night mind to loosen what the day would soon tighten again. It did not break the night apart or replace it all at once. Instead, it announced itself quietly, through small changes that were felt more than seen. Before any light appeared, the air itself began to shift. The deep stillness of night softened. Sounds that had faded returned slowly, one by one. Somewhere outside, a bird tested the air with a single call, then waited. Another answered cautiously, as though unsure whether it was time. Inside homes, bodies sensed this change even in sleep. The second sleep thinned further, losing what little weight it still held. Awareness returned more often now, lingering longer each time. People lay still, listening, wrapped in blankets that no longer felt quite warm enough. The cold remained, but it no longer deepened. It held steady, as if the night had reached the limit of what it could take. This pause was subtle but familiar. Many people woke briefly during this time, not fully, but enough to recognize that morning was near. Light entered rooms carefully. It did not arrive as brightness, but as a soft thinning of darkness. Shadows lost their depth. Edges became slightly clearer. A wall no longer felt endless. A ceiling could be sensed again, even if not yet seen. Those who were awake did not rise immediately. Leaving the bed meant giving up what little warmth remained. The day could wait a few moments longer. Morning, like night, was allowed to unfold at its own pace. Unpleasant realities were still present. Stiff joints protested the thought of movement. Dampness clung to fabric. The smell of the room, smoke, wool, old air, lingered heavily. None of this disappeared with the first hint of light. In shared spaces, people became more aware of one another again. A cough sounded less distant. Breathing felt closer. Someone shifted deliberately now, preparing to rise soon, though not yet. Dreams released their final hold during this time. What remained of them felt thin and incomplete, like fragments of conversation overheard and then forgotten. Few dreams survived fully into daylight. Most dissolved as soon as the mind turned outward. The body prepared itself quietly. Muscles tightened slightly, hands flexed, feet pressed against bedding, testing warmth and movement. These were not conscious decisions, but signals that rest was ending. Outside, the world gathered itself slowly. Animals stirred. A door opened somewhere nearby. Wood cracked softly as temperature began to rise, almost imperceptibly. The night loosened, but did not resist. For medieval people, this transition carried no rush. There was no expectation of immediate activity. Daylight brought work, yes, but it also brought warmth, sound, and visibility. The worst of the night was over. Still, the final moments of lying still were valued. People rested in them briefly, holding onto the quiet before voices and movement returned. This pause belonged to neither night nor day. Eventually, someone rose, carefully, slowly. The first movement of the day was often stiff and awkward. The floor was cold. Balance had to be found again. The body remembered its weight. Others followed one by one. The shared rhythm of night dissolved into individual motion. Blankets were set aside. Cloaks were adjusted. The night was released. Morning did not feel triumphant. It felt practical, necessary, expected. And so, without ceremony, the long night of divided sleep came to its end. Not erased, but completed, leaving behind tired bodies, quiet minds, and the steady knowledge that the same rhythm would return again, when darkness fell once more. When the day finally took hold, the night did not vanish. It withdrew carefully, as though unwilling to disturb what it had shaped. Light spread slowly, touching walls, floors, and faces that were still heavy with rest. Yet the night remained present, not as darkness, but as memory carried in the body. Medieval people did not leave sleep behind when they rose. The rhythm of the night followed them into the morning hours. Muscles moved more slowly. Limbs resisted sudden effort. The body remembered that it had rested in fragments, not in one unbroken stretch. Morning tasks began quietly. Fires were stirred rather than reignited with urgency. Water was fetched without haste. Animals were tended with familiar movements learned over years. There was no sharp division between rest and work, only a gradual shift from stillness to motion. The divided night shaped this pace. People did not expect to feel fully restored. Fatigue was not a problem to solve. It was a condition to live alongside. The body adjusted, conserving energy where it could, expending it where necessary. Thoughts, too, moved more slowly in the early hours. Conversations were brief. Words came carefully, often after pauses. The mind needed time to gather itself again after drifting freely through darkness. Traces of dreams lingered faintly. Not whole images, but feelings, a sense of distance, of movement, of something unfinished. These impressions faded as the day progressed, but they influenced mood quietly, without demanding attention. Cold remained present even after sunrise. Stone walls held onto the night's chill. Breath still showed faintly indoors. The warmth of the day would take time to arrive. People dressed in layers, accustomed to carrying the night's cold with them until the sun grew stronger. The memory of waking during the night did not trouble anyone. It was not discussed or analyzed. It had been expected. It had passed as it always did. Nothing needed correction. This acceptance shaped how people understood their own bodies. Waking at night did not signal weakness. Light sleep did not signal failure. Endurance mattered more than perfection. The rhythm of first sleep, waking, and second sleep existed beneath daily life like a quiet foundation. It did not demand attention, but it supported everything else. As the sun climbed higher, the night loosened further. Awareness sharpened. Muscles warmed. The body settled into work. Yet even then, the calm of the night lingered faintly, like a deep breath remembered long after it was taken. And as the day unfolded, no one feared the coming night. It was not an unknown future, but a familiar return. When evening returned, it did so without ceremony. Light thinned, shadows stretched, the world softened once more. The day released its hold, and the night stepped forward as it always had, not as an intruder, but as a companion. People did not prepare for sleep with elaborate rituals. There was no attempt to control the night or demand anything from it. They simply allowed it to arrive. Fires dimmed. Work ended. Bodies, already tired, responded willingly. Darkness gathered slowly, filling spaces that had been defined by daylight. Sounds changed character. Movement quieted. The night reclaimed its familiar shape. Sleep followed naturally. The first sleep came deep and heavy, drawing the body inward. It did not promise comfort. It offered recovery. Muscles loosened. Breath slowed. Awareness faded. Hours later, waking returned, gently, predictably. The body rose toward awareness without fear. The dark room felt known. The cold was expected. Sounds were familiar. This waking did not mean something had gone wrong. It meant the night was unfolding as it should. In these quiet hours, people existed without demand. They listened. They thought slowly. They prayed or did not pray. They endured discomfort without naming it. Cold pressed inward. Insects moved. Blankets cooled. Yet none of this disrupted the rhythm. It belonged to it. Sleep returned again, lighter now, carrying dreams shaped by memory and sensation. The second sleep drifted toward morning, uneven and gentle. And when the coldest hour came, it was endured quietly. People waited, knowing that the night always released its grip eventually. Morning followed, not suddenly, not dramatically, just as the night had arrived, gradually, without force. What defined medieval sleep was not comfort, but continuity. Night after night, the same pattern returned. It did not need to be improved. It only needed to be lived. The night was not an enemy to be conquered or escaped. It was a space to move through, slowly, imperfectly, and patiently. Sleep did not demand silence, warmth, or isolation. It adapted to noise, cold, and shared space. It arrived when it could, left when it needed to, and returned again without being asked. And so, across centuries of long nights and short days, people rested not by controlling darkness, but by trusting it. They lay down, they slept, they woke, they slept again, and that was enough. The night did not promise ease, but it promised rhythm. And in that rhythm, people found rest. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until morning came again.